As I stood near the car, I watched Nicholas comfortably settle into the passenger seat beside his mother. My mother-in-law glanced over at me with a smirk that said everything she didn't have to. "Neva, why don't you just walk home?" she joked, her voice dripping with mock concern. "It's only an hour away." Her laughter echoed in the car, though I felt no urge to join. Nicholas, sitting idly with his phone, didn't even glance my way. This dynamic had become too familiar, one I often tried to ignore, but this time was different. My stomach churned with a sinking realization. This was my life now. And I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay silent. When my mother-in-law leaned toward Nicholas and whispered something that made him chuckle, I felt a crack in my resolve, but I pushed it down. How did I get here? I wondered. The silence around me grew heavy, settling in with the late afternoon light as they finally pulled away. As I started walking, my mind replayed the day's events, each memory like a thorn in my side. I thought back to our hurried wedding, where my family's enthusiasm had made everything feel perfect. My brother's words of caution were mere murmurs against the fanfare of the day. "Nicholas seems nice, but be careful. Some things don't always show up right away," he had said, but I'd brushed it off. In those early days, Nicholas was my world. Kind, attentive, always making me laugh. I'd never met his family until right before our wedding, and at the time, they seemed perfectly pleasant. His mother even welcomed me with open arms, saying, "We're thrilled to have you as part of the family." I had no idea then that those words would come to haunt me, but now, in hindsight, I wondered if my mother-in-law had always been masking something, waiting for the right moment to show her true colors. Since the wedding, things had shifted in ways I couldn't have predicted. My mother-in-law's thinly veiled disdain became apparent the first time she invited Nicholas over for dinner without notifying me. Nicholas had promised to come home early, and I'd spent the evening preparing his favorite meal, only for him to call me at the last minute. "Sorry, Neva. Mom made something special tonight, and she really wanted me to come by." His words stung, though he didn't seem to notice. I played it off with a forced smile and reassurances, but internally, I was rattled. Over the following months, these unexpected dinner invitations became more frequent, with Nicholas barely noticing the impact it had on me. Each time, my mother-in-law would call right before dinner, effectively dismantling my plans. I could feel her amusement through the phone, and I began to suspect that her intentions weren't as innocent as they seemed. One evening, after yet another interrupted dinner, Nicholas handed me a Tupperware container with a casual, "Here, Mom wanted you to have this." I took it with a hesitant smile, already guessing what lay inside. Sure enough, when I opened it, I was greeted by the sour smell of spoiled leftovers. This had happened a few times before, and I'd brushed it off, convincing myself it was an oversight. But as I stared at the spoiled food, a new thought took hold. Was she doing this on purpose? I shook my head, trying to dismiss it, but my suspicion grew as I noticed the pattern. Every time Nicholas visited his mother, he returned with some form of gift for me, each one more unpleasant than the last. I considered telling him, but I knew he'd brush it off, attributing it to my imagination. Nicholas was too trusting of his mother, and I was beginning to realize it would take something drastic to make him see what was really going on. As time passed, I felt myself drifting further from Nicholas, his ignorance about his mother's actions driving a wedge between us. I began confiding in my brother, who'd always been my anchor. "Neva, this isn't normal," he'd tell me, worry evident in his voice. "A mother-in-law doesn't treat her daughter-in-law this way unless there's something seriously wrong." His words validated my own fears, yet I still hesitated to confront Nicholas. I didn't want to come across as paranoid or overly sensitive. After all, Nicholas was a good husband in many ways. He was attentive, supportive, and always ready to listen. But when it came to his mother, he was blind. He would dismiss my concerns as misunderstandings, leaving me feeling more isolated with each passing day. I told myself I could handle it, that I was stronger than this. But the truth was, her subtle harassment was wearing me down. Then one day, Nicholas came home late again, claiming he'd been invited over last minute. I decided to speak up, hoping he'd finally understand. "Nicholas, why didn't you let me know earlier? I had dinner ready, and this keeps happening," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He looked at me with genuine confusion, like he truly couldn't understand why I was upset. "Neva, it was just dinner." "You're reading too much into it," he said, brushing off my concerns with a dismissive wave. I felt the sting of his words, a familiar pang of disappointment sinking in. His refusal to acknowledge the issue was like a wall between us, and I was starting to wonder if he'd ever see the truth. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that Nicholas might never understand what his mother was doing, or the toll it was taking on me. Days turned into weeks, and my relationship with Nicholas continued to erode. He seemed more distant, often engrossed in his phone or preoccupied with thoughts I couldn't share. My mother-in-law's influence over him was becoming more apparent with each passing day. The final straw came when Nicholas suggested out of nowhere that we should move in with his mother. "She's all alone now," he explained, his eyes pleading with me. "It would only be for a little while, just until she gets back on her feet." I felt the ground shift beneath me, disbelief flooding my senses. The idea of living under the same roof as her was unthinkable, and I told him as much. But Nicholas was relentless, his mother's needs taking precedence over everything else, even our marriage. It was clear that he saw nothing wrong with her behavior, and that realization shook me to the core. Faced with the prospect of moving in with my mother-in-law, I reached a breaking point. For the first time, I considered leaving Nicholas. The thought scared me, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. I confided in my brother, who listened with a heavy heart, sensing my inner turmoil. "You don't have to stay in this situation, Neva," he told me gently. "You have options. You're stronger than you think." His words gave me a sense of empowerment I hadn't felt in months. I realized I didn't have to put up with this mistreatment, that I deserved better than a life overshadowed by my mother-in-law's influence. I began to formulate a plan, envisioning a life where I was free from her grasp, a life where I could finally be at peace. But as empowering as the thought was, it also came with a sense of finality that left me reeling. The next day, I had a revelation. I was going to leave. The decision was both terrifying and exhilarating, a mix of fear and anticipation that left me on edge. I didn't tell Nicholas yet, deciding to take things one step at a time. First, I visited a lawyer, seeking advice on how to handle the situation. I wanted to protect myself legally, to ensure I had a solid plan in place. The lawyer was understanding, offering guidance and support as I outlined the complexities of my marriage. As I left his office, I felt a newfound clarity. For the first time, I saw a way out, a path forward that didn't involve my mother-in-law's endless interference. The thought of breaking free from her influence was like a breath of fresh air, and I clung to that hope as I prepared for the next step. When I returned home, I was met with an unexpected sight. Nicholas was sitting on the couch, his face pale and tense. "Neva, we need to talk," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I sat down beside him, unsure of what was coming. He told me that his mother had been diagnosed with a serious illness, and she needed full-time care. "I don't know how to handle this," he admitted, his voice cracking. My heart twisted, a wave of sympathy washing over me. But even as I felt for him, I knew I couldn't let this news derail my plans. I'd already made my decision. "I'm sorry, Nicholas," I said gently, "but I can't do this anymore. I need to think about my own well-being." His eyes widened in shock, and I could see the realization dawning on him that I was serious. For the first time, he seemed to understand the depth of my resolve. Over the next few days, the atmosphere between us was tense and filled with unspoken words. Nicholas tried to convince me to reconsider, promising things would change, but I stood firm. My decision was final. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the struggle to comprehend how things had come to this. But as painful as it was, I knew this was the right choice. My brother offered me a place to stay, and I gratefully accepted, knowing I'd be safe with him. Leaving Nicholas was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but I was determined to build a new life for myself, free from the toxic influence of my mother-in-law. I packed my things, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind, and walked out the door, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. I was finally free. As I settled into my new life, I began to feel a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. My mother-in-law's shadow no longer loomed over me, and I could breathe freely, unburdened by her constant presence. I reconnected with friends, resumed my hobbies, and began to rediscover parts of myself that had been buried under the weight of my marriage. My brother was a constant source of support, reminding me that I deserved happiness, that I was strong enough to build a life on my own. Though memories of Nicholas lingered, I knew I'd made the right decision. In leaving, I had reclaimed my freedom, my identity, and my peace. And as I looked forward to the future, I felt a sense of anticipation, ready to embrace whatever came next with open arms. The darkness had lifted, and for the first time in a long time, I could see the light.